Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I believe you all can hear me. Just type in the chat. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I welcome you all again. Welcome to the webinar on why projects need artificial intelligence, overcoming complexity with technology. Please join me in welcoming the speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Atif Ansar. Dr. Ansar is the founder director of Oxford's program on sustainable capital intensive industries and a professor of megaproject management at the Said Business School at Oxford. Please be ready with your questions, if any. We will open the mic at the end of the webinar. And also to inform you, the recording of the webinar will be made available to you as soon as it goes through the video production team. Thank you so much for your time, and over to you, Dr. Ansar.
Thank you very much, Lamesh. Very good morning to everybody from the UK and good day wherever you might be in the world. I'm thrilled to be here today. We've been partnering with Project Controls Expo around the world, including in most recently in Washington, DC, and soon in the UK and Australia as well. So it's a delight to present to you. What I'll be talking about is why mega projects need artificial intelligence in order to get delivered on time and on budget. But first of all, greetings from Oxford. It's the best university in the world. Cambridge came in second, well done to them. But jokes aside, Oxford is truly number one across multiple areas. For example, we're the only university to have produced a COVID vaccine. And equally in the field of major mega projects, Oxford has one of the best faculties in the world, funded originally from British Telecom, going all the way back to 2005. And I've been part of that faculty basically since then. And essentially what we have found is that delivering big projects is not easy. So issues of cost overruns and time overruns are really pervasive. And we've documented that and come up with strategies to overcome that, which I'll be talking about later today as well. Oxford also is home to two courses. One's called the MSc in Major Program Management. I had the pleasure to direct this course for 5 years. There are scholarships for women, so I would recommend everybody to check it out. And it's a great course, and I'm sure some of you who are in the world of delivering projects will find it extremely valuable. Equally, the university runs a Major Projects Leadership Academy for the governments of UK, Australia, and Hong Kong. And that's been a very successful program in making sure that civil servants are also upskilled to deliver big government-funded projects alongside the private sector. The agenda for my talk today, and I'll take about 35-40 minutes and then open to Q&A, is the 3 C's of major projects: the challenges, the causes, and the cures. So let's begin with what are major and mega projects. Major mega projects are large dollar investments. The rule of thumb definition is major projects are about $100 million plus investment in capital expenditure, and a mega project is over $1 billion. But rail projects, for example, the Eurostar here was a multi-billion dollar program. Equally, the black and white photograph on my slide here is the Norris Dam, and the person looking at it is David Lienthal, one of the first directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So mega projects are in a way very romantic. They go as far back as the New Deal and well before that, of course. You know, a lot of narratives of nation building and the political sublime get merged when we talk about mega projects, along with the fact that they are these awe-striking big structures that we've built over the centuries. The examples are really varied. So it ranges all the way from aerospace programs to space flight, to data centers, to semiconductor factories, to big science projects, big dams, public rail, oil and gas, you name it. Anywhere between $6 to $9 trillion of new mega projects are started every year. That amounts to nearly 10% of the global GDP. So they're hugely impactful, both in terms of their cost as well as their potential benefits for society. And the opportunity is tremendous. So in the black and white photograph, very early steam engines, and now we've got railway that's all over the world, transporting billions of people every day. And similar stories can be told for just about any major city. So this is Singapore as an example. It was a sleepy port in 1970s. If you look to the left, there's barely any buildings. And now every single building in the color picture is a multi-billion-dollar mega project that built over time has created one of the richest countries in the world. So those sequence of investments, if done right, can unleash national prosperity. And it plays significantly into nation building. The Hoover Dam in the US, as well as the national highways that Eisenhower started, are emblematic of many of the nation building efforts, not just in the US, but in other countries in the 20th and 21st century. And it could be civilization defining. So like I mentioned with space flights, mission to the moon was one of the most expensive undertakings human beings had done in the 1960s. And equally with space flight today and the mission to get to Mars is a subject of great, a bit of a space race again. So that's all the really good stuff. So that's the inspiring piece for why all of us work in projects, the opportunity to create something out of nothing and create a huge amount of social welfare. Although mega projects power humanity, they are not that easy to build. So the outcomes can be good, but there's a pretty tough process to undergo. So let me switch to some of the challenges that these projects experience. The first big issue is that these projects face the problem of cost and time overruns. I'm just looking at the example of rail by way of an illustration. Rail projects have, on average, cost overruns of 42%. That means that a $1 billion rail project ends up being closer to a $1.4 billion rail project by the time it's finished. Equally, they also have a 42% time overrun. So that also means that a 10-year rail project has a tendency to become a 14-year rail project. That issue persists across any asset type. So defense projects similarly have both very large cost overruns as well as time delays. Dams nearly double their costs and also exceed their time by about 40%. So all of this has a big impact on the value of the private sector company that might be building these projects. But equally, these numbers in terms of cost overruns and time overruns don't disappear. We see them in the national debt, in fiscal deficit of governments, as well as share prices of various companies. This sort of problem of cost overruns and time overruns leads to an issue that we often talk about, which is watermelon projects. So projects that look green on the outside, but they're really red on the inside. And one of the key aspects or key contributions project controls professionals can make is to help overcome that watermelon project problem by ensuring that the reporting midway in the project is truthful. It's very rare that these cost overruns are detected until very late in the project's life, by when there's very little you can do to fix them. And project controls professional can play a really important role in ushering in the visibility and transparency you need in order to make sure that these cost and time overruns can be avoided. To drill a bit further into the rail dataset, by the way, this dataset is one of the world's largest, in fact, the largest out of Oxford University, built in conjunction with a number of colleagues, including Ben Freiberg, whose work you might have read elsewhere. There's well over 16,000 projects in there. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them later as well about the dataset. So to drill into rail projects, we studied nearly 432 rail projects, worth about $1 trillion in 2022 dollars, and it's a very representative sample. So we've got projects from around the world, including Europe, US, China, as well as variety of rail types like heavy rail projects, light rail, and urban rail projects as well. The average duration is give or take about 8 years, and the average cost is at least $1 billion for these projects. So they are truly mega in their composition. What this chart shows is a curve of cost overruns of these 432 projects. This particular curve is known as a reference class forecast curve. And this was an idea that was originally proposed by Daniel Kahneman, that my colleague Ben Flyberg at Oxford and I have done quite a lot of work on, just to orient you to the graph. On the x-axis is the percentile of all the projects which we're looking at. So 100 percentile basically means the 432nd project. The 50th percentile would be like the 215th project, so on and so forth. And all the different colors and shapes, the red, yellow, identify different types of projects in our database. And what we've then done is taken the actual outturn costs at full commercial operation, divided it by estimated cost at final investment decision, and that gives us the cost overrun ratio on the y-axis. So a ratio of 1 means that the actual cost is same as the budget, so it's on budget. Anything below 1 is a cost underrun, so there's a saving. So if somebody had ended up at 0.5, it means they budgeted $1 billion but spent 500 million. But equally, a cost overrun ratio on the y-axis of 4 means they budgeted $1 billion and spent 4 billion. And then we've sorted it in rank order, basically, from the lowest underrun to the highest overrun. And it produces this cumulative density function, which provides an opportunity to see what the risk profile might be for an upcoming rail project. So if you might have heard of this idea of regression to the mean or law of averages, means sort of the same thing. Basically, the cost overrun of any new project is going to get pulled towards the average of this particular curve. Overall, P50 is the median, which is 36%. So a typical rail project will suffer a 36% cost overrun. So $1 billion estimate will have a tendency to become a $1.36 billion estimate, but at P80 it gets much worse. So $1 billion estimate at P80 for about 20% of the projects, 1.5, will have a tendency to become 1.8 billion, give or take. So it's a massive, massive risk that people take. This idea, by the way, won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for Daniel Kahneman. So, and I'll come to talk about this notion of optimism bias momentarily. We can do something similar for time. So for time, the ratio on the y-axis is 1 means on time. Anything above 1 is overtime. So P50 is a fairly tolerable 15%, but P80 is a big delay of 65%. So here again, a 10-year program will have a tendency to become more or less a 17-year program, which can cause a huge amount of issues, for example, in terms of political wrangling over such a big delay. These cost overruns and time overruns, like I mentioned, have massive impacts on value creation and value destruction. There's a very simple idea in literature in corporate finance, which says that the value of the company or the value of the organization is the sum of the value of all of its projects. So for ExxonMobil to have a positive valuation on the stock market means that each one of its exploration and production projects is producing more revenue than the cost was spent in building them and maintaining them. So in a way, a very, very simple idea. But a research working paper that we worked on found that, for example, in the oil and gas sector, companies that are better project managers like Exxon have systematically outperformed companies like BP that have had a more patchy track record in terms of project management. So the conclusion of that is that your project management discipline, your ability to build CapEx appropriately is ultimately reflected in your share price. So value creation, like safety, is everyone's responsibility. It often happens that people working in projects are not as familiar with financial metrics. Some of the decisions about project costs and time could be taken in a vacuum, and they may be in the best interest of the project at that time, but they may not be in the best interest of the mothership. So there's, again, a little bit of that tension point. The project controls professionals are really helpful in trying to understand and making sure that value creation, life safety is everyone's responsibility. Obviously, I've chosen a private sector example here, but this can also be applied to the public sector in terms of the overall fiscal position of the government and the issue of sovereign default crises that we've seen many countries experience because of overruns on their public infrastructure. A second point I want to make here is this is the same data set that we looked at on rail projects, but now it's been sorted across the years. So the x-axis is the year in which the rail project was approved. Each black dot on my chart is a rail project. And on the y-axis, I've got time overrun. So here again, 1 means on time. Anything above 1 is overtime. And some projects, like this particular project at the very top, is well over 3 times overtime. The red line is the line of best fit across that scatter plot over the years. And as you can see, the slope is completely flat. And we use this evidence to argue that this suggests that no learning is taking place. It's not that projects are deteriorating, but they seem not to be getting any better. And even if learning is taking place in some areas, like people are getting better at civil construction, they may be finding other challenges in other areas, like in installations of systems like HVAC in rail tunnels, for instance. So in equilibrium, the cost overruns or time overruns haven't disappeared as time has gone by. So part of our mission, both as a researcher at Oxford University, as well as a founder of an AI company called Foresight, is to help change this and help the industry learn. So what learning would look like is for that red line to have a negative slope going towards the blue line, and that scatter plot of black dots converging onto the blue dots so that each project was built consistently on time and on budget, and there wasn't this massive variance and very large error. But the one thing to note is that experience in this industry is not the same thing as expertise. So just because somebody's worked in the rail industry for 30 years is no guarantee that they know anything about building a rail project on time. So often when people claim, oh, I've been working in this industry for 30 years, that's not a get out of jail free card, I'm afraid. So I'd encourage you to please stop saying that, because the industry has quite a lot to go in terms of learning. So look, the status quo at the moment is over time, over budget, under benefits, over and over again. Our life's work is to try and turn that to on time, on budget, to benefits every time, because of Foresight and our partners. So we're super excited to be partnering with Project Controls Expo and look forward to hearing from many of you as well. So if we had more time, I would have drilled a little bit more into understanding your context of how's the challenge of time showing up in your projects. What are you doing to address it? What are some of the ripple effects, like the impact on share price that I mentioned, and equally who is impacted in your business? But you can take that away with these slides and try and do that workshop internally with your teams. Now let's move to the issue of causes. So what is causing this cost and time overruns? I'm going to give you 3 explanations. 1 from psychology, a 2nd from political economy, and 3rd from physics. All of these are Nobel Prize winning ideas. So hopefully they help us understand why we find this persistent challenge of cost and time overruns. In terms of psychology, this is a famous optical illusion that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the question that arises upon looking at it is, which of these 2 lines is longer? Now, you probably know from prior experience that both these lines are meant to be the same, even though you cannot help but see the lower line to be longer. In fact, just because you've been previously exposed to this optical illusion does not make this illusion go away. Even the designer of this illusion, Frank Muller, cannot unsee this. So this optical illusion is where the brain just simply cannot do the job. And this is sort of an example of an optimism bias or a cognitive bias, where essentially the brain is unable to process the data that's in the environment. Now, one of the interesting, tricky things is that I could be lying to you, and I could have made the lower line deliberately longer. But because you have prior experience with the illusion, you would jump to the conclusion that they were both the same length, and that'd be the incorrect conclusion. So that's where the bias jumps in. The only way to debias this is to use a foot ruler and measure both these lines and actually write down. In this, novices tend to outperform experts, because a novice who's never experienced this optical illusion before might take a foot ruler and measure it, which psychologists call system 2 or slow thinking, whereas experts jump to the conclusion, oh, they must be the same, and then they're fooled. So here again, expertise, just years of experience in the field, is not a get out of jail free card from our human biases, which are evolutionary. In projects, that exhibits itself as optimism bias. So a kitten looks itself in the mirror and sees a lion with a big roar, and it thinks it can go out into the world and go hunting. And obviously, it would encounter a very shocking risk upon attempting that. The implication of that is, in projects, risk is not external. So if that cat gets badly mauled on its excursion, it's not because there was risk on the external world. It was because it underestimated it or overestimated its own abilities. So in projects, the biggest risk is the project managers themselves. So, provocatively, we always call it the biggest risk is you, not force majeure issues. So if your project is experiencing risks, look inside the project organization rather than to be blaming external factors that might be causing those delays or those cost overruns. And that means tuning in to our own human biases and figuring out ways in which we could overcome them, which I'll touch on momentarily. By the way, going back to my previous example, that you need measuring in order to overcome bias, that's the first area where big data and artificial intelligence come in play. Human beings are incredibly good at contextual intelligence, but we're very bad at computational intelligence. So this idea of measuring is not really baked into our evolutionary makeup. Big data and AI, to cut through all the hype, is like a measuring tool. It's a way for you to correct your vision, although they're not vision themselves. So they are ways to kind of remove the rose-tinted glasses, the rose-tinted view that our brain automatically has by correcting and debiasing the outside world. An example of optimism bias is that if you're trying to build 100 projects, say they're completely identical, and you have estimated the project duration to be 24 months, so the probability distribution in this case is a completely vertical line. In reality, of course, some projects will come in a bit early, so at 18 months. Some projects will be a little bit late, but within tolerance, say going to 30 months. And a few projects with big hairballs that have humongous delays. But overall, because of this probability distribution, the average shifts to 36 months. And this average is a lot of gravity. So next time you start a project for 24 months, sample from this population, it will have a natural tendency to pull towards 36 months unless you do something counterintuitive. So the law of averages, which is if you do average things, you get average outcomes, applies. Equally, if you want to defy this gravity, you'll have to use something different. Artificial intelligence presents that counterintuitive way of trying to defy this gravity of overruns in your projects. This is Dan Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize. He wrote an amazing book in 2011, almost compiling his life's work, mostly done in conjunction with his colleague Amos Tversky. I highly recommend this book as a way of thinking about life in general, not just projects, and how our human biases interact in sometimes very charming and sometimes a bit more risky ways in the way we operate. Now, Optimism bias has a political dimension inside organizations. So if the boss is extremely optimistic, they will then draw everybody else in the organization to provide really optimistic estimates. A fatal example of that is NASA's Challenger disaster. The then NASA director was really eager for NASA to launch the spaceflight, and insisted on people pushing really hard to do it. Now, we knew from historical data that the chance of a rocket blowing up, going up in the air, was 1 in 50. But that chance, that reference class forecast of rockets blowing up back in the 80s, was diluted further and further until by the time it was reported up to the NASA directorate, it was considered to be 1 in 100,000. So very, very minor. And the Feynman report that investigated the Challenger disaster makes a very eloquent reading on the political dimensions of this optimism bias inside organizations, and that's a 2,000 times underestimation of risk. So as these numbers go upwards inside the organization, they have a tendency to get sugar-coated, and that tendency can lead to fatal outcomes. So again, project controls has a really pivotal role to play in ensuring that as numbers go up and down the organization, that they are not covered in sugar. A final point I want to mention is it comes from physics, and it's a notion of complexity. In many ways, AI is a tremendous tool to overcome this complexity. This is a visualization of a Primavera P6 schedule for a data center. And what this is showing is all the milestones at the very top that need to be done in order to build this particular project. So from purchase of land to a lease signed with a tenant, all the way to earthworks or pad ready, core and shell ready, all the way to commissioning tasks, and eventually ready for service. In the middle are all the design, procurement, physical works, mechanical and electrical and plumbing works, commissioning works that need to get done in order to get to the ready for service date. And the green, red, and gray lines represent the relationships among these activities. So for example, a finish to start relationship will be a red line where there's strict dependencies. You can't start A until you've finished, or you can't start B, for example, unless you've finished A, whereas the green ones might be more forgiving, where you could start A and B at the same time. The industry, of course, calls this a precedence network. In mathematics, we call this directed acyclic graph, or DAG. These DAGs have very interesting mathematical properties, which one can use in order to fit very interesting graph machine learning algorithms, which my tech company Foresight's done, by the way, reading across over 100,000 Primavera files. And the point here, though, is that this is too much information for any human team to keep in mind at any given time. We know from other Nobel Prize winning work that human working memory is extremely limited. So here's Herbert Simon. He was an AI researcher at Carnegie Mellon in the 50s and 60s, wrote extensively in economics and computer science and psychology. And one of his papers is fascinating from 1970s called How Big is a Chunk? And what he discovered on self-experiments in trying to memorize long text strings and word strings is that even though he was a Nobel laureate, he could only remember 6 or 7 chunks at any given time. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way of increasing his working memory. So in organization life as well, there's really, people have between 5 to 7 chunks to play with, and 2 or 3 of them are already occupied with family matters. So really, there's only 3 things people can generally keep in their minds at any given time, hence the rule of 3 in communication. So people often talk about the rule of 3 to make your point in 3 points in order to make sure that people can actually understand that. So whereas in projects, you have to worry about a million things. And here again, human working memory needs to be augmented with machine intelligence to provide a much better picture of what activities you really need to be paying attention to, and for some kind of an AI to provide a prioritization mechanism to ping the most important activities to the human beings, but not the less important ones. Otherwise, we just get overwhelmed by our environment. And then the tendency is to just run around like a headless chicken, working on whatever seems important rather than is in fact important. So project sites might be very high stress and actually cause a lot of mental health issues in the construction industry, partly because people may not be seeing the output of their result in an immediate way because they're working out of priority. This same complexity that confounds human working memory also creates nonlinear risk that's very difficult for the human brain to wrap its head around. And the issue that arises is that although scale grows in a linear manner, complexity grows in a nonlinear manner. So in this particular example, I often ask my students, how much time do you think it takes you to write a 100-word email versus a 100,000-word PhD dissertation? Now, it turns out that writing a 100-word email is super easy for most people. Almost all of us send 1,000 emails every week, but you can't write a 100,000-word PhD in a week. So although the scale of the PhD is simply just 1,000 emails, the reality is it takes much longer in order to get to a PhD. And this idea won the Nobel Prize for Peter B. Anderson in a notion known as broken symmetry in physics. And the idea is quantities have qualities of their own. So as that complexity, as this picture gets busier, the overall explosion of risk is much higher. And this particular network then becomes prone to the chaos theory, which is small butterflies fluttering at the very beginning of the project will have tendency to create very large uncontrollable risks in the middle. Here again, you need machine intelligence paired with human subject matter expertise to make sure that design documents are not running late, your noise management plans are not running late, your permits are not running late at the very beginning, because those seemingly small delays are going to cause uncontrollable risk in the middle of the program. Now, these nonlinear risks expose projects to two forms of risk. One are really high impact one-off events. So that could be a tsunami in the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan, for example. And these can cause really large delays and really large cost implications. A second one is what we call cumulative fragility, which is death by 1,000 cuts. So it's very minor things that are missed that are almost so innocuous that they would barely register on the retina of the executive. So that could be like the noise management plan that's not filed on time. Now, one of the interesting things is that a tunneling project we worked on in Asia, we had discovered a very similar issue where a noise management plan wasn't filed on time about 3 years before the tunnel boring machine was meant to go live in the dry season. When the tunnel boring machine did go live in the dry season, they got a stop work order because they didn't have the permission to operate. By the time they got the permission, they were drilling in the wet season, the tunnel got flooded, the whole thing caused a 3-year delay. So it's almost unthinkable that a minor risk, like I don't have a noise permit, to a 3-year delay seems almost unlinkable, but in these complex systems, they are. When I was a younger scholar, I used to be really drawn to black swan events because they're really high impact, they're very sexy. But as I get older and hopefully a bit wiser, I realized that most projects die a death by 1,000 cuts. And the only way to overcome that is through a huge amount of discipline. So it's not a dramatic risk that causes the risk. It's just daily misses that accumulate into a big issue. Overcoming all of this requires a lot of organizational maturity. Organizations tend to oscillate between one extreme of extreme overconfidence to another extreme of complete despair. So at the agony side, people start to claim, woe is us, we can never do this, like we have nothing. And on the other side of extreme overconfidence, they feel like we've absolutely got everything, we don't need the external world, we can do this 100% without any issues. So the key is that neither of these extremes is the reality. You have to form an as-is realistic view of where you are. And often begins, for example, just collecting a very simple data set of your past projects and looking at what was our estimated cost when we got the board approval and what was our actual cost. And it's sometimes very difficult emotionally for people to even allow for such an exercise to take place. Or, what was the estimated time of our projects? What was the real time? And just look at the ratio. And if the ratio is above 10%, there's a deeper issue to resolve. Now let's talk about cures for a few minutes and then I'll open to Q&A. In terms of cures, I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular chart, but what it's showing is time overruns and cost overruns for rail projects. And what we can see is that although many rail projects are a disaster, so they have both a very large cost overrun and a very large time overrun, so large in fact that even the revenue or the benefits they're generating can't possibly pay back the combination of the cost and time overruns they've suffered in terms of the net present value depletion. There are quite a few really good ones as well. So it's sort of the 80-20 principle of some being really good and others being quite bad. What we've learned from the really good ones is that the really good ones exhibit two things. They exhibit cognitive maturity and they exhibit strategic diligence. And where you have cognitively immature team and a team that's not disciplined, you end up with a disaster. So in a way, the things you have to do to deliver really good projects are really simple. It basically requires pig-headed discipline, but people tend not to want to do that discipline. So I'm going to encourage you to adopt that extremely disciplined, emotionally mature approach. And that's what this cognitive maturity or that emotional maturity looks like in projects. A first aspect of that maturity is how you form expectations. Do you form realistic expectations as a team, or do you form magical expectations? Realistic expectations are data-driven. So if you were building a new gas turbine, a realistic way of estimating the time would be to look at least 20 to 30 historic projects and really understand what had happened in them, understand if they'd had a time overrun issue, and bring in that knowledge into your new estimate. By the way, that's very rarely done because people just build the estimate for the new project without necessarily considering the historical data systematically, partly because the industry can make accessing that historical data really difficult. So that leads to magical expectations more often than not. So even if we know that it takes on average 4 years to build a gas turbine, you might see that somebody's put in 18 months as the expected date. And that's in the magical realm. And it could be driven by just the customer being very demanding, but that doesn't mean that the estimate is realistic. So that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis is the open-mindedness, the mental orientation of the team. Is the team open-minded, i.e. is it engaging with the outside world? Can I find the P6 schedule of the project with, easily, or do I have to beg 15,000 people and the CEO to help me get that file? If you can get that easily, you're in an open-minded culture. If for example, tracking down the P6 schedule is nigh impossible, then you're in a closed-minded team. That closed-minded team that lives in a bunker and that also has magical expectations is prone to generating a massive disaster. By the one example, although not a complete disaster of a project, but salvaged in the end, but it could have gone really badly, was a rail project in London called Crossrail. So in 2016, the civil works were nearly complete. So the then CEO announced that we're 80% done, although it was just the civil works that were done. And there was a huge amount of systems work and systems integration work that was still left to be done. And just about that time, his project controls team kept bringing him bad news about very slow progress on the systems integration. And even back in 2016, the project was meant to open in 2018. Even back in 2016, the project controls teams within Crossrail had very serious doubts of whether the project could be delivered by 2018. The CEO's kind of knee-jerk reaction was, instead of listening to the bad news, was to fire the project controls team. Now, the consequence of that was in 2018, 3 months before opening this 10-year project, he announced a 4-year delay and obviously lost his job immediately. In fact, the entire board, the entire exec got fired, and a new team was brought in. So that's where kind of the ostrich effect of putting your head in the sand just because you don't like the news about where the project's going is not a helpful attitude. It simply leads to deferring the disaster rather than tackling with it upfront, and making it work. When the new management came in, they did two things. First of all, they resequenced the program and put in a lot of realism of what was going to happen. So the next 4 years wasn't just a one long bar. It was 100,000 activities in a deterministic schedule, very clearly laid out. And on openness side, they made it public. So as a researcher at that time, I could get access to their monthly updates of P6 files, which is generally unthinkable for a lot of public projects. And that's a level of open-mindedness. In fact, the CEO, the new CEO started to provide a monthly update to the public about what was happening with the project and largely discussing those challenges. So building that open-mindedness culture. So if you detect a lot of defensiveness in your teams, that's a big red flag. So coach them into giving up that defensiveness. If you're finding that people are hiding data under pretext of confidentiality or commercial sensitivity, that's a big red flag in a project, and you have to work with them, particularly as project controls professionals, to overcome that defensiveness, because it's very likely that under the bonnet a lot of risk is incubating. A second piece of that is strategic diligence. I'm going to skip this equation for the time being in interest of time and conclude here. And the basic idea in strategic diligence is you need to do basics brilliantly. So you need to plan well, you need to execute well, and you need to look at risk very, very carefully. In many ways, this is basic stuff. But this basic stuff is what people find really hard to do because it demands a lot of discipline. So discipline planning means planning in a collaborative way, locking people up in a room and doing an interactive scheduling workshop, understanding what are the 5 to 7 big go-no gates that the project has to go through in order to get built. I'm often surprised when we do schedule reviews of how few of the really big chunks of work are in the schedule. It's filled with lots of punch work items, but sort of a culmination of big piece of work, like getting to a watertight building or like completing certain system integration tests. They're very, very hard to find sometimes. And so it's almost got to be built from the top down in terms of the schedule of what are the big gates, what are the big driving milestones, and then what are the activities that are going under it. Planning, of course, using tools like Primavera P6, Microsoft Project, but then also artificial intelligence tools like Foresight that sit on top of that data to make sure that the quality of that plan is stress tested against industry benchmarks, and make sure it's robust, not tolerating a culture of commercial sensitivity or confidentiality. There is some element of that in the construction industry, but no other industry overeggs it as much, and it really ultimately bites all participants. And kill Excel. Like Excel is killing your projects. So if there's a lot of use of Excel inside your organizations, then you've got to find more lockdown ways of planning and reporting information. And equally, things like Power BI, etc., built on top of Excel are not things I would believe in, because it makes everything very, very prone to massaging, which is where this risk emerges. That's on the planning side of things. On the execution side of things, it's again bringing that discipline to ensuring that people have visibility of their plan, that they believe in their plan. So you can't have a plan that's perfect on paper, but people then go on and do their own thing. In terms of execution, it's about that daily stand-up, looking at the schedule in a filtered way to understand which teams are working on which priorities this week, how does it come back together, driving pace in the schedule, really, like even minor variances, like if something's meant to start today and slips by a day is a big issue. And just holding the line on that discipline is really important, but also putting in some governance mechanisms like two lines of defense to make sure that there's assurance that the work is getting done, as well as setting up some kind of a troubleshooting committee to resolve conflicts within a very short period of time, like 36 hours. And finally, in terms of risk vigilance, what our research has shown is that if people are planning really well and executing really well against the plan, risk tends not to happen to them. So, it's risk is sort of like my earlier argument, the risk is mostly internal. But having said that, it's still helpful to do risk practices, which is to de-bias forecast and use historical information into building better estimates. But then where you do see risk is to zap it. So not just sort of get into kind of a lingo around risk mitigation, but I believe in risk elimination. So really going after, so if long lead item is a risk, let's buy it now rather than just write a report about it. And then finally providing adequate contingencies. All of that brings together in terms of saying if you're doing these basics brilliantly, it's that process will lead to the positive outcomes you're seeking. Thank you very much for your time today. I'd like to open up a Q&A and very happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ansar. On top of the screen, can you see the Q&A tab? There are a few questions.
Oh, great. Sorry, I can't.
And there are some questions in the chat. So I have copied them on Word doc, but then I'll copy it again for you so that you can reply to each question one by one.
So Nermeen asks, are our project controls processes fit for purpose if we are creating so much complexity? So Nermeen, that's a very interesting question. I think the complexity is a natural consequence of what we're trying to achieve. So, big data centers they are generally physically complex, and there's no way of reversing that complexity. Give you one example. About 10 years ago, a 2 kilowatt cabinet was the norm in building a data center. Nowadays, 50 kilowatts in one cabinet in terms of the density of chips that are getting squeezed in are not uncommon. And I've seen 100 kilowatt cabinets in labs. So nearly a 90x increase in the chip density inside cabinets of these big, just data center projects. Now, with that comes a huge amount of cabling, huge amount of issues with heat and heat control. So suddenly an air cooling system that worked just fine at the 2 kilowatt density is simply not going to work at 50 kilowatts. So you need to change the design and create more, liquid cooling. Now, that liquid cooling has never been worked on before in data centers, and people are now beginning to realize that they are leaking. So that complexity is kind of not always man-made. It's simply a function of what we're trying to achieve. And, we're pushing the boundary of engineering to the limit at the moment. And you must have seen with SpaceX's landing, this is kind of absolutely cutting edge engineering in terms of pushing those boundaries. So the complexity, I think, is a more function of our ambition and creativity, which is fine. It's just, that's great. But I think our project controls processes, the textbook for project controls was written in the 1920s. So it's more the trouble that it's not fit for purpose because it's just not been updated. And I think slightly held back by this constant refrain of, I've got 30 years of experience, which means it keeps us harkening back to the 1920s because those textbooks haven't evolved. So yes, I do agree with you. Modern day project controls processes are not fit for purpose for the kind of ambition that human beings have these days. And that's where you have to really modernize both the availability and the analysis of data, both on your project as well as comparable projects, to get those benefits. And all of that requires really overcoming a deep resistance in the industry to look at data. Construction is kind of at the Moneyball phase of baseball. So if you're familiar with Moneyball, the story, basically baseball was this kind of very intuitive sport, and people didn't look at it through the eyes of metrics until one person began looking at it through data and saw a very different world than the world people had created for themselves. So I think construction is going through that metrification process, and project controls has a really big role to play in becoming fit for purpose for the complexity we're attempting. And again, artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, these are your friends in conjunction with really, really good people. I hope that answers the question. Richard says, how big is the problem on the long term? Have you found that principals have regret of starting the project after an over budget, over time project is finished? Richard, that's a very good question. I think principals have regret because they're often bankrupt at the end of really bad projects. And it's sort of a tale of two cities. So some people do get very rich when they manage their projects really well, and other people do see their equity get washed out when projects go bad. So give you an example, AirTrunk is an Australian data center builder. It was bought for 3 billion Australian dollars by Macquarie in 2020. It just got sold for $24 billion in 2024 by Blackstone, right? So an 8x return on a physical infrastructure company, that's massive. It's because they've been really thoughtful about their project management. Contrast this with a data center contractor in the UK, ISG. ISG just went bankrupt 2 weeks ago, and it's because they made commitments they couldn't deliver on, and ended up in situations of cost and time overruns. A similar situation had happened to Carillion a few years earlier. So absolutely, I think where people go into a situation with very low ball estimates, they do come to bear the consequences. And do you find that calculated costs and time are optimistic on purpose to get them through the political decision process? Absolutely, yes. So, there's a lot of documented evidence where people own up to the fact that they had to lowball estimates in order to get the project done. That doesn't make the job of project controls easier if people have started with a political estimate, but it means you need even more transparency, because you almost have to flush out that lowball estimate after project start almost immediately and reset the budget and the time. To give you an example, when Sepco arrived at London Olympics, midway through the delivery organization, he realized that the budget available for London Olympics was inadequate. So as part of him taking on the job, or as the project director for the delivery organization, he said publicly, he's like, look, you need to double my budget or I'm not taking this job, because the budget is a lowball budget. And I'm not going to put my professional reputation at stake to work for a magical budget. And because he was politically very savvy and argued for that upfront, he got it. So they doubled the budget, and to his credit, he didn't exceed it. Great. Have I covered all the questions? Oh, there's a few more, sorry. So Matt says, how do we account for performance change and innovation within the RCF? Presumably the benchmark projects are complete and future projects may enhance performance with new technology and systems, and that is not included in the RCF dataset. Matt, that's a very, very good point. That's absolutely true. RCF projects are looking at historical data. They should be updated all the way to the current, but these law of averages have a lot of gravity. As new projects arise and they improve their estimation, that gets incorporated in the RCF, so the RCF moves. There's one more exception, which is a critical case. So when there's a jump change in the technology, an example of that is Guggenheim Bilbao. If you've seen the building, it's like falling spaghetti covered in titanium. And those are the projects are really hard to build. Typically, on average, signature architecture has cost overruns that are closer to triple on average. That project was delivered 1% under budget. So that's a very surprising result. And that in social science we call a critical case, where we expect it to go to 300% cost overrun, and we're experiencing an extreme outcome on the other side. And when you diagnose that one case study, so you can learn a lot even from one project in such a case. When you diagnose that case study, you realize that they use very advanced tools like CATIA, which is used in aircraft design, to specify the design extremely well before going to tender. And as a result, the bids for the titanium cladding for the building came within 1% of each other, which is again a testament to how precisely the quantities were stipulated in the tendering document because of their use of advanced technology. And so that helps. And then that becomes an example that when you have these critical discoveries, that you can override the RCF. So you don't necessarily put Guggenheim Bilbao in that RCF because it's almost starting a new reference class. John asks, are project controls not fit for purpose because they ignore that there's a contract in place between the doers and the client? John, I would love if you say more about your question. My sense is project controls, depending on the organization, can't sometimes make its mind about who is it advocating for. So sometimes when project controls take the view that they're advocating for the project and that their job is to provide transparency and governance with truthful information, they do a really good job. But if project controls gets into their mind that they're advocating for the owner or they're advocating for the contractor, and that their job is to somehow create social harmony and make sure nobody has any conflicts, then they start feeding the machine with lots of sugar-coated data, or just kind of like dropping the ball on not really like knowing that there are issues, but not wanting to talk about them, not confronting them. That's where the fitness for purpose falls apart. So I think I would say tools are really important, but mindset and just taking a vantage point of who are you working for is really important. And ultimately, I think when people come together in project, they should be working for the project. So project is the entity they have to protect, not the owner, not the contractor, not the consultant. Should I keep going?
So two of the people have raised their hands, so I'll just open the mic for them.
Okay. Go ahead, Sanjeev and Mohammed. Oh, sorry, Ibrahim.
Hello, is that it's an excellent, thank you. Good morning. It's an excellent condensed presentation.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. Okay, yeah, I mean, the AI, the way you presented it is you're working from top down in a construction industry. For example, I'm in a project where it's like 50,000 people, or or close to that, or 40,000 people. How do you have a platform? Do you have software that can help people from doing it from bottom up? How do you zoom in all this into a software or into a platform, or and that we can apply through a process of a big company, construction company? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So absolutely, that's what I've been dedicating my life to for the last 6 years, is to build that software platform. So, very happy to take this offline. We're called Foresight, and I'm happy to put that in chat. Check us out. And the basic idea is, like in any coordination mechanism, for example, how an air control traffic control works, you need a control tower. So you need a combination of centralized coordination and decentralized action. So although individual planes are flying all over the world, somebody has to, provide for that control tower thing to take place. Now, project controls is conceived to be that control tower. So my very summary answer to you, Sanjeev, is invest in your scheduling. Your schedule is that rough point between the top down and the bottom up. Because the schedule, when conceived appropriately with the layout of all the major elements that need to get done, provides the clarity of vision at the top of what needs to happen, roughly when and in what sequence. But bottom up, it then gets divided, splintered into thousands, if not millions of activities. Those individual activities have to be done by few people. And you need a mechanism to dispatch that work to them so they know what to do, where to go, when to turn up. So in brief, Foresight reads that P6 data, it provides AI insights with our historical data set to make that easier, but then also provides that control tower functionality in which you can dispatch these tasks to your project managers, and then they can onwards dispatch them to the people on the site. So I'm very, very happy to talk about that separately.
Okay. And I have a question, Atif. This is Sanjeev.
Hi, Sanjeev.
So first of all, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Good data behind it. Would it be possible to get hold of these slides?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
With pleasure.
Okay. And the second question is just a general question. Projects have been late and budget forever, for as far as even when critical path was invented.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, since the advent of technology, use of computers, software in project management, the lateness and budget overruns have gone up, have increased, not reduced. So what will be different this time? Is the industry ready for change? Is this AI not just another rat hole that we will go down? Projects really used to be, I have seen projects being more on time when they are managed on the wall rather than inside a software, even mega projects.
So Sanjay, very good question. So I think, a mega project on a wall would be very hard to do, although there's an element of that as well. For example, if you need clarity of like, what is it that we're trying to achieve this month on this mega project? We're just trying to build our foundations. You can build a plan for those foundations on the wall. So, but it has a very, very stringent information requirement. So a couple points. One, the complexity of what we're trying to build every year keeps growing. So like I mentioned with my data center example, what was considered cutting edge 10 years ago is now considered obsolete today, like completely obsolete. Nobody would even touch it because it's old technology. So our kind of social expectations, customer expectations of the kind of service you're looking for keeps growing up. So iPhone 3, when it first came out in 2007, just was this wow product. And now it's in the museum. And it's just been not even been 20 years. So I think the overall engineering challenge gets more and more extreme every year, and that's not going to go away. And so you need a coping mechanism. And sometimes these overruns is because our level of ambition keeps growing as a society. So you need tools. So like an Austrian tunneling company I interviewed, they said, look, when we build simple cut and cover tunnels now, we don't have overruns like we used to because we've learned to build them. So they've used their reference class forecasting data to both improve their estimation as well as improve their skill in repeating these things again and again. He's like, but when we have these very complex tunnels these days with the ventilation systems and fire alarm systems, etc., we're getting overruns from the systems and the system integration piece. And those overruns are getting really bad in some cases. But these things keep notching up. Because there have been a couple of high-profile accidents in which people died in fires, etc. So it means new legislation comes in to restrict the safety. It makes it harder to build and much more harder to build. right? So that's where you need tools to keep pace with that ever-going concern. If you're building repeatable projects, you are in luck because you can really figure out a fine-tuned system of doing it again and again and again, and expecting that there'll be some failure. So, the first 4 space flights of SpaceX all blew up. But I don't think for Falcon 9 or Falcon 9 Heavy, they've had an accident since 2012. And they've reflown these rockets over 100 times. Of course, they're doing Starship right now, and they're expecting many of these Starships to blow up, which they did, but they were not carrying any payload. But now they've come to a point where they can reliably launch and land this gigantic rocket. Like, it's crazy, the size of it, right? So that's the approach that I'm advocating, basically.
Fair enough. No, I think that's great. So since it looks like you are very mission driven in terms of getting projects done on time, right? And I have approached the same problem from a very different angle, right?
Yeah.
Your approach is tackle complexity with complex. My approach has been tackle complexity with simplicity, but doesn't matter, right? So it will be a good collaboration offline. And let's not.
Absolutely.
This is not the forum, so I would love to have your contact information also.
Please. And I, by the way, intellectually completely agree with you. You have to tackle complexity with simplicity, but to simplify complexity, you need tools. And an AI is the tool to.
You might need tools. Yes, you might need tools, and you might sometimes just need a different mental model. But
absolutely,
both are required. Absolutely. No, but it would be great to have a dialogue with you separately from this.
I would love that.
But great presentation. Thank you,
and
Sanjeev. Love your sense of mission.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Look, this is a wonderful community. I'm really pleased to be invited to it, and I'd love to interact more.
Yes, everyone. Dr. Ansar will be speaking at the PCE Expo UK and Australia. So if you are in Australia, if you are in UK, and if you are planning to attend the event, please be there in Megaproject zone, both at UK and Australia, and you can further talk to him directly. He will be further describing the things more in detail.